Thanks to all of you for being here on a Friday evening. It's always a hard task to ask anyone to come to an event in Bangalore. So I'm really grateful for your presence here today. So this book, which has just come out 2 weeks ago, is somewhat ironic in its timing. 5 days from today, we will be marking the 50th anniversary of the imposition of the emergency by Indira Gandhi on 25th of June, 1975. And I say it's a little ironic because this book was not timed to come out at the emergency. It's come out, and we can talk about how that might have happened. But in some ways, when I began working this book on what now seems an embarrassingly long time ago, the idea was actually to sort of look at the entire arc of Indira Gandhi's career and somewhat take the focus away from the emergency itself, which seemed to occupy all our sort of mental, intellectual, conversational energies whenever she was mentioned as a figure. And the idea of doing that was not so much to minimize the importance of the emergency. In fact, even in this book, the emergency has two pivotal central chapters which are allocated to it, but to more or less kind of decenter the emergency in our understanding, which is to say, not to imagine that the emergency was the end point towards which everything was tending or the inflection point from which everything has gone wrong. I think one of the ways in which I wanted us to start thinking about this period, frankly, for myself to start thinking about this period as I researched this book, was to think of the entire period that I've characterized in this book as the long 1970s. By the long 1970s, I really mean a delimited historical period which stretches from approximately 1966-67 till about the mid-1980s. And what I suggest in the book is that that really is the period in which the contemporary history of India turns, right? From the early formative sort of years, which for shorthand we can call Nehruvian, to something that looks closer to the India in which we all live today. So how did we get from there to here is really the story that I wanted to tell in this book, as much as the story of Indira Gandhi's political career, the various kinds of choices that she made, the various kinds of decisions that she took, and the impact that all of that really had. Now, as I said, I started working on this book, right, maybe about 12, 13 years ago, or maybe 14. And at that point of time, I was just trying to finish a book on the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, in which, of course, again, Indira Gandhi was a central figure. But that book was explicitly pitched as a global history of the creation of Bangladesh, partly because I just felt that thinking of it purely as a regional, a subcontinental kind of affair was not doing justice to many important dimensions, which led to this extraordinary outcome, which was the creation of a very important new state in South Asia itself. And while I was working on that book, I came across a number of archival kind of materials, which at least to me were new at that point of time. Not just the sort of papers of some of her closest advisors, P.N. Huxer, B.K. Nehru, and many others, but also of many of her contemporaries, colleagues, adversaries, antagonists, right? For instance, the papers of Chaudhry Charan Singh became available around the same time in the Teen Murti library. Morarji Desai's papers got almost fully declassified in the period that I was working. So you had a sort of a view of the person and of the events, not just from her office, as it were, but also from those who were ranged up against her throughout this period. More importantly, from about 2014, about 10 years ago, the National Archives of India started declassifying a lot of archival material pertaining to this period, which again to me was surprising, because we all tend to think of the National Archives as this kind of slightly haphazard organization which does things to its whim. But much to my surprise, the richness of the material that is now available to study this period is quite extraordinary, including files from the Prime Minister's Secretariat, right? So literally from the desk from which a lot of things were done or sought to be done in that time, we can look at what was happening. So for me, this book turned out to be a longer project, partly because I wanted to make full use of this kind of archival bounty that it opened up and was continuing. What was a trickle in 2014 became a flood by 2020 or thereabouts. And I was really struggling to keep on top of all the materials that were becoming available. So this book eventually has ended up becoming telling a story which runs along two tracks, which do intersect, of course. The first is the story of Indira Gandhi, her years in power, her coming to power, her years in power, including the period when she was out in wilderness before coming back. But it is also an attempt to situate Indira Gandhi's political career, the kind of political choices that she made, all the actions that she took within the backdrop of the long 1970s, as it were, right? So the idea is both to tell the political story of Indira Gandhi, but also to track and explain these extraordinary changes which happened in this time. And as I said, those two things do come together in ways that are quite interesting for us to understand. So what do I mean by saying that, this period of the long 1970s has some kind of unity? And I'd say, again, this unity is not simply an artifact of us understanding this period as the Indira Gandhi era in Indian politics, but rather of saying that if you look at the history of the 20th century, the long 1970s has a certain kind of, periodic unity to itself, which I think is very important for us to remember, because that sort of global 1970s, as it were, impinged on a lot of what was happening in India, and in fact was quite decisive at certain moments, right? So if you want to plot some of the highlights of that, I would say let's begin with the period of 1967-68, which historians refer to as a global 1968. That's when youth revolts across the world were kicking off. Yeah, you saw the emergence of young people as important agents of social change in the context of countries across the world, right? Not just in United States, where there was an anti-Vietnam War kind of protest, but also in countries like France and Germany. China had its Cultural Revolution going on. Interestingly enough, one of the countries where this phenomenon of 1968 really had an impact was in our neighborhood in Pakistan, where a student movement actually led to the overthrow of the authoritarian regime of Ayub Khan in 1969, right? So global 1968 really, as historians call it, is one interesting starting point. From there, you move up the arc to, say, the period between 1971 and 74. This is a period when the global economy really gets into a new kind of an orbit. Because what happens in 1971 is the decision of the United States of America to exit the Bretton Woods system of international monetary arrangements, which means that previously exchange rates between currencies used to be fixed, and they were all pegged to the dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold, right? So there's a fixity. You could predict exactly what is the exchange rate of currency. Richard Nixon in August 1971 decides to get the United States out of anchoring that system, which then means that you have a global economy where exchange rates are suddenly floating, and nobody really knows how to sort of even think about a system like that and manage it. So that is the first kind of vector of economic turbulence, which really is, again, global in scale. The second thing is something that happens as a result of the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973, which leads to the Arab countries in OPEC, the petroleum cartel, to jack up oil prices almost by 4 times in a matter of about 4 months. So oil prices go from about $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel by the end of 1974. And that means literally seismic levels of inflationary shock to the global economy. And between this exchange rate crisis and this oil shocks, the entire global economy really is in a great period of turbulence. And that has direct and extreme consequences for a country like India. In 1974, India actually experiences its most concentrated period of inflation. It's the sharpest kind of inflationary period in all of India's 20th century history, right? The history of Indian economy. Again, by the time countries are kind of gearing up, learning to deal with this extraordinary sort of turbulence, which is both an economic, a financial, and an energy crisis, by 1979, you have the second oil shock, which happens as a result of the Iranian Revolution, right? Again, in the backdrop of what's happening today, it's important to remember what a shock by supply side of Iran deciding to sort of, again, hike oil prices meant. And in 1979, again, the impact on India was extraordinary. We now tend to forget that in the year 1979, the Indian economy contracted by 5%. It is the sharpest, negative 5% GDP growth, sharpest contraction of the Indian economy in that period, right? Which then meant that, India had to move towards the IMF for a major loan in 1980. And then you started embarking on a series of kind of economic reforms, et cetera, which then play out later in the context of globalization, right? So this entire period from about 1967 to the mid-1980s is a period of extreme change and change at a pace and velocity which is actually now very difficult for us to grasp, but also of extreme turbulence. And democratic states across the world were caught up in this stuff, right? I mean, we tend to think of the Indian emergency as this extreme instance of the imposition of outright authoritarian rule. But one of the salient facts of the global 1970s is that very few democratic governments actually got re-elected. most of them were struggling to sort of master this particular crisis which was thrown upon them. And so India is really only at the extreme end of what is a spectrum of problems that many other democracies are facing. So we are not a kind of outlier entirely to this larger story, which is why I wanted to pitch the changes of this period against the backdrop of this global crisis, right? So let's go back to the sort of inaugural moment of Indira Gandhi's ascent to power, and I'll kind of take you through very quickly. We can talk greater at length. I'm sure Arun will draw me out on things which are very telegraphic here. So Indira Gandhi's ascent to prime ministership in early 1966 happens against the backdrop of two sort of prime ministerial transitions which happened. 1964 with Jawaharlal Nehru, January 1966, Lal Bahadur Shastri's very unexpected demise in Tashkent. It happens on the back of two wars that India has fought, 1962 against China and 1965 with Pakistan. And it happens against the backdrop of 2 years of successive drought, which means that this predominantly agrarian economy is experiencing a very serious situation which is bordering on famine in various parts of India, right? So these sort of crises, which are the backdrop against which Indira Gandhi comes to power, manifest themselves in the 1967 election in terms of a series of setbacks for the Congress party, right? Now, the Congress party up until that time is a dominant political player in Indian politics, not just in the way that we think of as a party which has a majority. Congress parties in its heyday, in the period between 1937 to 1967, dominated Indian politics at all levels, right? They dominated it at the union federal level, they dominated it at the state level, they dominated right at the local level, right? At every level, there was a dominance of the Congress, which is why it's called something like a one-party dominant system, is the way that political scientists used to characterize that old Congress. But that old Congress took a very bad knock in the 1967 elections. Back in the day, both general elections and state elections used to happen simultaneously. In the general elections, the Congress's majority became a bare majority, 283, and the Congress lost control of very important states, particularly in North India, right? So in a sense, the Hindi heartland really sort of started slipping out of the Congress's control. 1967, soon after the elections sort of happened, within a couple of months, you had another kind of political signal which goes up, which suggests that things are not all that good, which is the beginning of a revolt in this place called Naxalbari in West Bengal, which then leads to the rise of a insurrectionary movement, which is entirely opposed to the Indian state and the constitution and everything else, right? So what it shows is that the political system as a whole is in crisis. It is not just the Congress party which is in crisis, but the Congress's crisis is a systemic crisis, because the Congress is so much the part of the system at that point of time, right? It's the behemoth. At the same time, because of these economic problems, drought, wars, everything, it means that your major sort of instrument through which economic development is being thought of, which is planning and the planning commission, the 5-year plans, etc., are set aside. The Indira Gandhi government in 1967 sends off the planning commission on what is dubbed as a planned holiday. They said, put them in abeyance for a couple of years. They say, we'll revive you when times are better, right? So this is a perfect storm. And it is in this perfect storm that Indira Gandhi comes to power. And, when she comes to power, she has very few concrete ideas about what she wants to do. I think the one thing we can be sure about is that her view of how to deal with these crises was that she actually aimed at something like a restoration to the Nehruvian model, right? She felt that what she needed to do was to provide enough stability so that the country could go back to the sort of principles and practices which characterize the Nehruvian period, right? Which is Congress dominance, but also a stable, planned kind of economic development, moving towards greater state sort of control of the commanding heights, socialism, quote unquote. We can discuss that, what that ever meant. But her vision really was to restore, and she always saw herself. And one of the reasons she comes forward in 1966, even 1964, when Jawaharlal Nehru dies, congressmen in the usual sycophantic style, tell her that, listen, you should just, put your name forward. And she says, no, I'm not interested. I have other things to worry about at this point. But in 66, she really feels that in the face of all of these crises, the country is going to be taken in some very different direction, and that, she is somehow the restorative kind of agent. And the irony that this book tries to underline is that while Indira Gandhi turned out to be the most powerful sort of dominant politician of India in the next 17 years, she had this vision with which she came. But what actually she ended up accomplishing were a series of things which were totally orthogonal to her restorative vision of what she wanted to do, right? And those changes you could see happened in three main areas. I'll quickly sort of go over them. One was in the domain of the political system. The second was in the mode or style of politics that she inaugurated. And the third was in the domain of what you think of as political economy, right? Now, each of these three things were changes which I think were very, very significant. These are the most important changes of the long 1970s. And it is those changes which really link that era to the India in which we live, right? And hopefully we'll give you a sense of what that is. So let's talk about each of these very quickly in turn. So when I say changes in the political system, I do not simply mean the rise of new political actors. Like, say, for instance, there were new groups like, dominant peasant communities, farmers, like Charan Singh in Uttar Pradesh, the rise of OBCs and Dalits as important actors. All of that is true. But I'm talking about changes which are systemic in a sense that they affect all actors in the system. And when we think about systemic change in that sense, I think it's important for us to think about it along two vectors, right? So the first axis of systemic change is what you would think of as the institutional kind of game which is being organized and played out in any political system, right? In the context of India, it is really about the powers and functions that separate various branches of government, right? So you have the executive, you have parliament or the legislature, and you have the judiciary, right? And each of these has a certain area in which it has powers, it has certain functions that it's supposed to do. In theory, this is a system of all kinds of checks and balances, which is supposed to ensure that, and much of this is laid down in the constitution about what are the various kinds of power which are there, right? Now, this aspect of the Indian political system, which is the first aspect, undergoes a dramatic change in a sense that the executive in the period between 1967 and 1974 becomes extraordinarily powerful in comparison both to the legislature or the parliament and to the judiciary, right? So there is a huge shift in the balance of power towards the executive. Now, how does that happen? It happens in the first instance because Indira Gandhi is, after the 1967 defeat in Congress party, in order to consolidate her own position within the party, decides to break the Congress party. The new party which is created is Congress R, as it is called, is Indira Gandhi's party. She obviously has much greater control. But what gives her complete dominance over the party, the Congress party, which she has split, is her victory in 1971, which was quite unanticipated. It was a gamble. She called elections 1 year earlier. She took a gamble and it paid off. She won an extraordinary victory. And then there was the victory later that year against Pakistan in the Bangladesh crisis, which then meant that Indira Gandhi was being described by The Economist tongue-in-cheek as the Empress of India. And then you had state elections in 1972, because only the central, general elections had been called 1 year ahead. And in the state elections, the Congress party just sweeps everything through, right? So the Congress is once again restored to its extraordinary dominance in the political system. But all of that is now seen as being due to Indira Gandhi. In fact, rather than the party being the agency which delivers power, the entire party is beholden to the prime minister in ways that are unprecedented in the history of Indian politics. Even Jawaharlal Nehru always accepted the restraints that the Congress party imposed on him. That was not true of Indira Gandhi from December 1971, certainly after 1972. And that meant that the parliamentary party, or which is to say that portion of the party which is represented in parliament, is no longer a check on the executive. I mean, normally, you think of a figure like Boris Johnson, right? I mean, why was Boris Johnson exited from power? Because his own party in parliament said that we cannot support your policies, right? So you need to have that subtle kind of check which the party exercises on the prime minister. That goes away. Then the party has this extraordinary majority, not just in parliament, but in states, which means that all your super majoritarian constitutional amendments, 2/3, etc., 50% of states can now be passed, right? And when the executive has become dominant over both the party and parliament, Mrs. Gandhi in 1973 then turns on the judiciary, right? There is a running battle between the judiciary and the executive in Indira Gandhi's tenure over a range of things, particularly around the question of the parliament's right to amend the constitution. Are there any limits on that? That's the question. We can discuss more. Arun is more of an expert on that matter than I am. And she wants to make a point that, that's not the case. The parliament, because it represents the people, has absolute kind of prerogatives to amend. And in order to make sure that the Supreme Court is pliant, she actually supersedes the two senior most judges of the Supreme Court and puts in her own appointees there, right? So by 1973, effectively, the balance of power in this very carefully established system of checks and balances has totally sort of concentrated in one highly powerful executive, right? So that is the first most important systemic change that happens, because then everyone has to respond to what that means for themselves, whether affirmatively or negatively, right? The second aspect of systemic changes is what you would say are not so much rules and functions or powers and functions of various kinds of branches of government, but what are the rules of the game by which any form of democratic politics is to be played, right? I mean, any human activity requires certain kinds of rules, right? I mean, you want to play cricket, you have to abide by certain kinds of rules. We cannot constantly keep saying that we will not agree with those rules and still claim that we are playing cricket, right? In a similar way, parliamentary democracy also has a set of rules, norms, conventions, precedents. Many of them are written, unwritten, but obeying or whatever, at least abiding by them in most circumstances is the only safe way to play this game. But what happens from 1967? Because 1967 is the first serious competitive election in Indian politics. You have a number of state governments which are not belonging to the Congress. So that then sets in train a whole series of horse trading of legislators, poaching people, destabilizing governments, using powers under the Constitution to put assemblies under suspended animation, dismiss them, etc. Right? The rules of the game, so to speak, start unloosening quite quickly from 1967 onwards. Right? By 1972, the parliamentary opposition, which has been totally decimated between the 1971 and 72 elections, decides that, listen, there is just no way that you can take on the Congress party in these kinds of polls under a prime minister who is so, so to speak, so powerful and so popular, etc. And then from 1974, when student agitation begins, and the student agitation begins under the impact of the inflationary pressures that I spoke about, right? I mean, that is what triggers the student agitations first, but then it takes on a political cast, which first calls for the resignation of the government of Congress government in Gujarat. Subsequently, a similar claim is made for Bihar. And then there is a movement which Jayaprakash Narayan leads, which basically is about Navnirman and so on, right? But what is happening throughout this period, especially between 1972 and 1975, is that the parliamentary opposition more or less decides that hitting the streets and demanding for resignations of governments is a better way of dealing with the Congress party and Indira Gandhi's power rather than looking to play the election game, right? In 1974, there's a state election in Uttar Pradesh. And the opposition loses that, even though the UP Congress is in complete disarray, right? So that is more or less the last straw which breaks the camel's back as far as they are concerned. So by the time you come to 1975, both the concentration of power has become very extreme, and in consequence and concomitantly, you have a total unwillingness on the part of practically every player in the political system to play by what I've described as the rules of the game. Of course, the most important such player was the Prime Minister herself. And in fact, I quote in the book, I found a letter that she wrote to Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, right? I mean, you may wonder why she was writing to Yehudi Menuhin. He actually wrote to her after the emergency saying that he was very sad that she deposed an emergency. And she writes, this is like 2 or 3 days after the emergency is imposed. She says, democracy is not an end in itself. Democracy is only one means to get to the final end, which is national unity, security, prosperity, etc. Right? This is an extraordinary statement if you think about it for the Prime Minister of India to say that she doesn't actually believe that there is any substantive value to democratic proceduralism altogether. Right? But that is the broad normative framework within which this transition has happened. Right? And as I said, unless and until we understand that kind of broad gauge change which happened, it's actually very difficult to understand how we got to something like the emergency. I mean, think about it this way, right? I mean, most of our discussions on the emergency, even today, tend to be about why did Indira Gandhi impose the emergency? It's a fair question, right? So, there are different kinds of answers you could give. One answer was that she imposed the emergency because the Allahabad High Court ruling of 12th June 1975 basically said that her election as Member of Parliament was voided, set aside. Then she got a conditional stay from the Supreme Court which said you can continue as Member of Parliament, but you cannot kind of stay on, you cannot vote in as you can stay on in office as Prime Minister, but not vote as Member of Parliament, etc. So her legitimacy is imperiled. And that is the most immediate impetus and reason for her to, go after that. Now, Indira Gandhi herself maintained practically till the end of her life, and you can see various kinds of YouTube videos of interviews that she gave in the later 70s when she was out of power. She always said that, listen, there was a major, serious internal security threat to India. And the fact is that neither the Shah Commission nor historians like me have found any evidence of such a threat, because no such assessment was ever sent up to the Prime Minister. But she actually has extraordinary responses. I think somebody from the BBC asked her, and she says, "You think the Prime Minister of India gets intelligence only from Intelligence Bureau and these police in India?" Of course not. I have my own sources. But she maintained it throughout, right? So, and we can have those kinds of discussions about why she imposed the emergency. Was there a threat? Was it simply to hold on to power, etc.? But I think we must make a distinction between Indira Gandhi's intentions behind imposing an emergency and how an event like the emergency actually came about. Those are two different questions, to my mind. They are related, but they are different questions. Because what caused the emergency is a question which forces us to ask this question of saying, how does a system which apparently has all of these checks and balances, all of these countervailing pressures, which is organized on principles of democratic legitimacy, popular sovereignty, actually literally on a stroke of a pen moves towards outright authoritarianism? How was that possible? And that was only possible because of the story that I've been telling you, of the concentration of power in the hands of the executive, of the loosening of the rules of the game, including on the part of the Prime Minister, who believes that democracy has no procedural substantive value as far as she's concerned. So without that prior change happening, you actually could not have had the emergency. So in some ways, the only thing that the 12th June verdict did was to make sure that thereafter the imposition of the emergency was more or less unavoidable. Unavoidable because all the other checks and balances which are there to prevent such an outcome are no longer in place. So which is why I believe that, instead of focusing purely on the emergency, purely on what Indira Gandhi wanted, we have to look at this larger systemic transformation of Indian politics, which happened in this period, right? And that continues in the post-emergency period as well. The Janata government comes in, they undo some of the worst aspects of the emergency, but this kind of derogation of the rules of the game is a continuing game. So one of the things that the Janata government does, for instance, is to dismiss all Congress state governments soon after the 1977 election. They say you have no legitimacy, you have lost such a bad election, your leader herself has lost all power, why are you in power, right? Now, by what rules of the Indian constitution or of parliamentary democracy is that an acceptable thing? But the interesting thing is the Supreme Court actually rubber stamps that also. Yeah. And of course, Indira Gandhi's logic has always been, what's sauce for goose is sauce for gander, right? So when she comes back to power in 1980, she does exactly the same thing. Dismisses all the Janata state governments. And the Supreme Court once again rubber stamps that as well. So what you see is that the whole aspect of the normative kind of structuring of parliamentary democracy and the rules which are required to be there are consistently being sort of eroded, disregarded throughout this period, which is why you have so much political turbulence in the long 1970s in Indian politics, right? So this is again something that is not, you cannot pinpoint it only on Indira Gandhi. It's a larger systemic sort of change which happens during that period, right? Similarly, as I said, one of the other things that Indira Gandhi wanted to do was to kind of take India back to the Nehruvian model of planned economic sort of policy making, etc., right? But what she actually ended up doing was something quite orthogonal to that particular intent to restore to something which was older, right? And what she did initially was actually to adopt a short period of liberalization in 1966 under the advice of the World Bank in the United States. She actually agreed to devalue the Indian currency, undertake certain reforms. There was huge immediate sort of blowback, including from the Congress party. So she put all of that on hold. Then subsequently, when she broke the party and she wanted to sort of signal that she has more progressive leftist credentials, etc., she pushed for much greater levels of state control over the economy, right? I mean, that is the period when you have the Monopolies Act, which is being passed. You have various kinds of ways of controlling foreign investment in India through the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act and various things. I mean, an entire stranglehold of institutions is imposed on private enterprise in particular, right? And she believes that that is the road to socialism. But what her government starts realizing pretty much from 1971 onwards itself, once the Bretton Woods and the foreign exchange crisis kicks in, but certainly from 1973 when the oil shocks hit, is that this is a recipe for economic disaster. And very quickly, from about late 1973, they start backpedaling. In fact, in 1974, India goes to the IMF to sort of negotiate for a loan. And as part of that, adopts a very sort of conservative macroeconomic policy, inflation, wage freezing, in a sense of not agreeing for DAs despite inflation, etc. These are very tough conservative macroeconomic policies. In fact, the first thing she says, when the emergency is imposed, is that one of the things I want to do during this emergency is to keep inflation under control. That is how conservative the so-called socialist, has become under the pressure of the global economic crisis of the 1970s. And that is pretty much what continues. So through the emergency, you have a gradual attempt to unravel some of the more onerous sort of restraints which have been placed on the private sector to allow a very slow, halting, unwilling level of deregulation. It is done under the pressure of circumstance. That is the important thing for us to remember, not because of any ideological conviction, policy conviction. You are just forced to do it in order to survive, keep the show going. And there is a much more sort of pro-business attitude which already comes in during the emergency, which is why someone like J.R.D. Tata actually says that the emergency has done a few good things for us. I mean, like, why are we thinking that this regime is totally bad? And this continues through. In fact, when Mrs. Gandhi comes to power in 1980, and she wins this spectacular election just 3 years after that very, gloomy loss, there is a reception held for her in Ashok Hotel in New Delhi, and which she attends. And her host is a person who has recently become very prominent in the Indian business circle called Dhirubhai Ambani, right? So the fact was that the Indian business community actually wanted Mrs. Gandhi to come back to power, precisely because of that negative 6% growth, the whole shock which was being delivered by global forces. They just felt that she's a much better bet for stability, and which is exactly what she goes on to do, more pro-business, opening up, again, under the pressure of having to do things for the IMF and so on. So what you see in terms of our economic policies, at least at the level of macroeconomic policies, etc., is this kind of actually and somewhat unwilling and unwitting move towards liberalization, right? So this is a person who's come in saying that she wants to take you back to Nehruvian socialism, but ends us getting up to some very different location, which is one of the sort of ironies. But the other thing which she does during this period, which again is a consequence of the kinds of failures of economic development that India was facing in this period, is to put on road an entire new imaginary of how we tackle poverty. And that was through targeted anti-poverty welfare schemes and so on. She was the one who began it. In fact, the bank nationalization story was important precisely because it enabled her to get fiscal resources in order to be able to do those kinds of policies, right? And today those policies are, you look at any day's newspapers and any part of this country, whether it is national, local, or regional level news, it is these welfare schemes which dominate the imaginary of what development means, right? So once again, in a very real sense, by turning her back on the older developmental model, which the Nehruvian era sort of actually heralded, she ended up taking us somewhere very different. So what I want to leave you, therefore, is with a sense that, at a moment like this, when 50th anniversary of the emergency, when we are going to be focusing a lot on the excesses that happened, obviously we should learn a lot of things about what happened, what went wrong in the emergency. I do talk about all of that in the book. But I think it's also very important for us to ask certain deeper and more fundamental questions about how actually was it possible for a democracy to kind of, at a stroke of the pen, kind of slide into an authoritarian system. And the only reason that could have happened was because so many things had already sort of gone awry with that system and continued to go awry subsequently, right? Similarly, I would like to just leave you with this idea that no matter how powerful an individual, no matter how powerful a political leader, their intentions and what they actually accomplished historically tend to be somewhat divergent. And in this case, I think Indira Gandhi sort of wanted to go back to the Nehruvian period, but ended us taking somewhere towards 1991, if not quite there. So let me stop here, and Arun, we can have a conversation.
Thanks, Srinath. May I invite Arun up, please?
So I see that we have a very mixed audience. There are people here, especially in the front rows, who have a physical memory of Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister. And then towards the back, we also have students who are probably going to be very curious about getting through the book. But thanks, Srinath. I think I've had to read the book in about a week's time, and I'm still processing it. But I think your summary and the themes that you broadly spoke about give us a lot to talk about. I think the way we designed it is a 30-minute sort of discussion between us, and I want to make sure that we leave time for other questions. So I'll just start by saying a little bit about. So Sandhya introduced Srinath and mentioned his books. I think this is your 6th book in the last 15 years, and there's a way in which a lot of Srinath's work, as he explained, the 71 War book, it seems almost like this book is the culmination of a lot of things, going back to your first book, which I had read and the Nehruvian era and the wars that were undertaken while he was still prime minister. All of that seems to feed into this, right? And with the benefit of hindsight, one can see that you've drawn from all those projects. But let me just start with a general question. And there's been a debate in the country. You are now a professionally trained historian on the value of popular history versus academic history, right? And much has been said by people on both sides of the aisle. I think you are in a fairly unique position because this book is very much, for my purposes, an academic book. I read it as an academic. If you read the prologue, which is about 30 pages, and there's a short epilogue for 10 pages or so, and in the middle you get 10 substantive chapters, which follow the chronological order that Srinath has just told us, starting from her appointment. So chapter 1 starts with her appointment as Prime Minister in 66 and goes all the way till chapter 10. We end with the assassination. Right? And it's a pretty gripping account. As you can tell, even from his presentation, Srinath has an unusual mastery of dates and times and is able to sort of pack all that in. I read fiction as a respite from academic work. And as I was reading this, I said, I'm getting a little confused of whether I'm reading a thriller or I'm reading an academic work, right? And I mean this in a really good way. And I think there's a lot here. What I will do is, let me start with that first question, because I think, as I said, this is both a work of academic history. It has a 30-page endnote section, which is full of citations to really good academic work. Srinath is also pushing against a lot of conventional ideas about Indira Gandhi's term, both in the field of politics as a leader and political economy, which I think this book is really pushing the boundary of established thought when it comes to political economy in particular. And some of my questions will be about that. But at the same time, I think it can, somebody who doesn't come with a foreknowledge of that academic work will also find this work very interesting because it is designed to draw in people. Right? There's a certain literary flair that Srinath has, and it's not going to put off somebody who wants an accessible introduction, or more than an introduction, elaboration of this period. So my first question is, would you want to comment on this supposed divide between popular history and academic history and say something about it?
No, thanks, Arun. I think that's an interesting question. So, see, again, let me just first lay my cards on the table, right? I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have no formal degree in history. So, in a sense, by standards of most professional historians, I wouldn't count as one of them, right? I mean, I think the last time I took any history course which is on my transcript is in grade 10. So, I'm purely a historian by practice, by inclination, and by training by myself, rather than having to sit through. I mean, of course, I now have a sort of, an appointment in a department of history. But so in a sense, I have always seen myself as slightly, outside the academic configuration of South Asian history. That's partly been because of the kinds of topics that I've worked on. As you said, things like military history, diplomatic, international history are not things that are career-making moves in the world of South Asian history. So, if any of you are looking to do things, then I'd advise you to look elsewhere, right? I mean, I only ended up doing those things because I was in an international relations kind of department. Now, in terms of substantively, whether there is a distinction between, popular history and academic history, well, I mean, I think there are stylistic differences which you can immediately pick up. I mean, I think most academic history tends to speak to other academic historians, which means that you are engaged in presenting your materials in a way that interrogate and plays your contribution. That's what counts in that world. I suppose popular history is more about, trying to get a certain kind of understanding that you have developed of a certain period or a topic across to a wider range of people. So I think if you leave that kind of stylistic tick aside, it's actually not very clear to me that there is that much to be said about the distinction, right? Now, I think what, at least in the Indian context, tends to happen is that there is a sense that if you are doing popular history, it only has to be a certain class of narrative storytelling, right? Now, storytelling is very important to historians, right? I mean, narrative is the principal device through which we explain change. So I will never deride storytelling as just storytelling. It's very important. It's a very important tool for us to work with. But I think what I find is problematic is this idea that, listen, the only thing that historians should do is to tell you a good story, right? I think we have to do a little bit more than telling you a good story. We have to tell you why the story turned out the way it did, right? So explaining change over time is, I think, fundamental to any serious historical enterprise, whether that's done by a popular historian or by an academic historian, is, I think, only a matter of this thing, right? I mean, to me, the most important question that I ask when I read a book of history is not just, is the story interesting? Have I learned more? But also about how does the explanation actually hold up, right? And when I was writing this book, I was very keen both to be able to reach out to a wider audience. That's why this book is published with a trade publisher and a trade imprint. But at the same time, I was very clear that I also wanted to have this kind of explanatory analytical thrust, which is, to me, a very central aspect of understanding what the story is all about. So much of the challenge, really, and I have to thank my editors here, was to actually make that kind of more analytically driven sort of narrative line understandable and graspable to people who don't have a background in terms of knowing the details of these things. So I think, and to do it within what to me seemed like a short compass, right? Because I've written books which are at least 50% bigger than this. I know that not many people have had the misfortune like you of having to read them. So I thought this time around I'll try a shorter book so that I can inflict it on more of you if I can sort of get away with it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So, another related question. I guess when I saw the title, and in history, there's a debate over great man or great woman history, right? And in a sense, the title seems to suggest this is about a significant political leader, and that's what you're engaging. But I think you've explained this also, that you're interested in change. And I think the way in the presentation you said the question of why did Indira Gandhi impose the emergency is an important question. And I think you deal with that quite significantly in the 2 chapters that you talk about. But you're interested in another set of questions. So maybe a little bit also on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I think this is, again, another dichotomy, which I think, particularly in terms of Indian kind of discourse around popular histories, is a misleading dichotomy, right? That there are some kinds of historians who are only interested in abstract kind of explanations of social change. Marxists are somehow seen as kind of exhibit A of that kind of tendency. And then there are others who believe that individuals matter a lot and that we have to, bring individuals back into that history. But, funnily enough, it was Marx who said that, people make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, right? I mean, that really, to me, captures what historians' real sort of problem is, which is that we have to explain what individuals are doing, but we also have to explain in what context they are doing those things and how that context shapes, changes, modifies the outcomes of what they try to do. And which is exactly the kind of argument that I was making here, which is that, it is not enough for us to say what Indira Gandhi wanted. It is also very important for us to understand what she managed to accomplish. And oftentimes in history, what people accomplish from a historical vantage point is actually quite different from what they may have intended. And this is not purely an unintended consequences story. It happens because people operate in historical circumstances which have other kinds of elements which are operating, right? I mean, so even the most powerful actor in any political system can rarely get their own way and get the outcomes that they want. And that is, for us, a very important thing to remember. So that is not to diminish the role of the individual, but to precisely place that individual in the historical context. And I think that is an important point for us to sort of remember, because I think there's a lot of sense that popular history is best told through individual stories, whereas academic history operates through something else. I think those are all misleading dichotomies which we have to this thing, right? I mean, historians have to work hard to reach out to people. We cannot take audiences or readers for granted, definitely. But I think these kinds of ways of thinking about it, which I find is somewhat disturbingly prevalent in the Indian context, right? I mean, Indian historians don't care about individuals. They don't think about biography as an important thing. No, it's not the case. I mean, the question is, what do you do with the life of an individual, right? Rather than whether you think the life is intrinsically important or not.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think when you made your presentation as well, and I think part of the richness of the book comes from not just that Srinath is making an argument about assessing Indira Gandhi's tenure, but the archival work that he's done, and he explained the process. I think the telling anecdote, a particular, and even in your talk, you referred to actual quotes from Indira Gandhi's correspondence. And I think that for me certainly was a very new element. The exchanges between her and her father, her and Haksar across several decades, really bring to life also this particular personality and how she's engaging with that. I'm going to just read out, and just so people have a sense of the style that Srinath, in case you haven't read him. I've read some of Srinath's work. I haven't read all. I'm very glad that I got to read this. But I was telling Srinath just before we started that I've actually read a short chapter that he wrote in a book which in my field, I do comparative constitutional studies, and I look at legal systems in Asia generally. This is a book which Ram Guha edited in 2014. It's called Makers of Modern Asia. Those of you who are familiar with Ram's work, he's written a book on Makers of Modern India, and this seemed like an extension of that. And Srinath wrote the chapter on Indira Gandhi in 2014. That's a 29-page chapter, which is now developed into a 300-page book. That book was reviewed by a scholar called Robin Jeffrey. Srinath cites him. Robin Jeffrey has written, I think it's still regarded as one of the classics when it comes to the study of newspapers in India. Robin was born in Canada, came to India under the RIE program and taught English in Chandigarh, learnt Punjabi, I think. And he writes about both Punjab and Kerala. And Robin, who at that time lived in Singapore, and the book has profiles of important Asian leaders, Indira Gandhi and Lee Kuan Yew being two of them. He writes this review, and I'll just read out because I thought it captures the spirit both of the chapter and of the book. So Robin says, this is from a review, an academic review, which came out in a journal called Pacific Affairs, published in Canada in 2015. And Robin says, Raghavan's essay surprised me. I expected to be a bit bored by a story that I thought I knew well. But Raghavan, like Guha, works in the archives like a beaver in a forest. And I thought that was a good description. I think Ram Guha himself has talked about being an archive rat. Maybe in the world of animals, I would say beavers are probably preferable to rats. And Robin has this wonderful way of capturing that. And I think this book, and I wonder if Robin will have a chance to see this, because he will find that Srinath's beaverish habits have only expanded. And there are many, many little, nuggets which he's dug out and put in the book. He goes on to say, and he writes well. I think Robin is a Canadian of a certain vintage, and that's high praise coming from Robin. Finally, he says, and this is what I wanted to really go on about. He says he provides as insightful and fast-moving account of India from the 1960s to the 1980s as one will find. And that's what I was reminded of when I read this elongated version from, as Srinath said, 1966 to 1984 in 10 chapters. Right? It's gripping. You also get a sense of how monumental those changes were. Right? And every generation thinks that it's gone through a remarkable period. And what's happening now is unprecedented. But it's really, and Srinath's talk told us about the economic changes, the political changes, the changes to party structures that was happening in that time. And that was quite fascinating. And now to a question, and to allow Srinath to sort of elaborate. So the end of the talk, you said three things that you really focused on: changes to the political system, changes of doing politics, the style of politics, and finally, the change to political economy. And I wondered if you want to talk I think in the epilogue, you say the most impactful of these three, possibly, is the changes to political economy, right? And one of the pleasures of reading this book again is, you refer to the great classic authors when it comes to political economy. My colleague is here. We were just having a discussion about political science that is taught in Indian universities. Unfortunately, a lot of these scholars are not taught anymore in a regular political science department. Francine Frankel, the Rudolphs, and many of what they were sort of talking about. But I think what you ended with, and I think this will surprise some people and you'll probably get some pushback, but one of the things I study is the regulatory state in India. And I was very intrigued. And I would say I'll have to probably digest it and then get back. But perhaps you can elaborate, why do you say in the epilogue that the most impactful period of the long 1970s, so not just Indira Gandhi, she was of course an actor in many of these events, is the effect that that period had on political economy? Yeah.
Yeah. So as I said, I mean, there are two aspects of political economy which changed in this long period, which I think are quite salient. So one is this kind of, move towards getting the state to relax its grip on the economy, right? Deregulation. And as I said, again, it was not done because of a desire to deregulate. It was not done because there was some clear vision that you wanted something called liberalization of the variety that you get in 1991. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that what happened in 1991 began exactly in the same way there. But history doesn't move in straight lines, right? I mean, so sometimes there's a quote by Bertolt Brecht, the German poet, that I sort of use in the book, where he says that, if there are obstacles, the shortest distance between 2 points may be a crooked line, right? I mean, that's the way history moves. I mean, it doesn't move in straight lines always. And one of the crooked lines here that we see is that, someone, a very powerful prime minister who's actually claims that she's an advocate of socialism, is under the force of circumstances actually forced to do things which go against the grain of her own liking, thinking, everything else. And what you get as a result of that is a consensus within the Indian system, which starts building up from the mid-1970s, that we need to move to some very different kind of a model. And that absolute regime change, so to speak, in that economic sense, happens only in 1991. But things are kind of already moving in the direction of what needed to be done. But the second aspect of it, because this is one aspect, right, about the state and the sort of, particularly the private sector and the economy. But the second aspect of it is, how does the state think of its role in development, right? See, the Nehruvian state had a clear kind of developmental model. And that developmental model was to be achieved through 5-year plans. The basic developmental model was what you would think of as structural transformation of the Indian economy. That you needed to get people from farm to factory, or some sort of variant of that through economic planning, is the way that that was thought about, right? And the idea was that poverty as a problem would get addressed as this transition happens. People will move to relatively higher sort of, more, roles which are economically productive, which will then mean that it'll be more remunerative for them, etc. That is seen to be the answer to the very serious problem of poverty which independent India inherits. But by the time we come to the mid-1960s, and not just because of Indira Gandhi, but because of a range of sort of, reality checks which the planning system has to take into account, you come up with a very different imaginary of how to deal with the problem of poverty. Now, poverty is now seen not as something which can be alleviated over time, but as this absolutely terrible condition for at least certain sections which needs to be addressed in the here and now, right? And that means that you start embarking on targeted welfare anti-poverty schemes for various groups, right? You need to first measure those groups. So you come up with ideas like poverty line. Okay, who's below the poverty line? That tells us, but then the question becomes, where do we peg the poverty line, right? And then that debate continues over several decades. But this idea that obviously we are not a rich enough country to universalize all of these provisions. So they have to be targeted, they have to be given to certain groups. And that particular way of thinking about not just poverty alleviation, but development as a whole, in some ways is, I think, the most important consequence of the long 1970s for our thing. And in some ways, I mean, if I can put my cards on the table, I think it's one of the most deleterious sort of consequences of that period, is because, it has stunted our developmental imagination, and it has made our politics hostage to a certain model of political economy, which I think is in the long run bad both for our economy and for democracy. It is bad for democracy because, this whole regime of welfare that we deal with is actually, contrary to all appearances, highly depoliticizing. I mean, when people are called labhartis, that is exactly what the system intended them to be. You're just a beneficiary, right? I mean, you're not a right-seeking citizen. You're not someone who's active, who's trying to. So I just feel that is something which came out. And if you ask my normative judgment on it, I think it's actually quite deeply problematic. I mean, what is the alternative we can discuss later, but that was definitely, I think, to my mind, if I'm sitting here in 2025, the most important economic or political economic consequence of what happened in the 1970s.
Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions and we'll start moving towards the area that I'm more familiar with, constitutional law. And I think one of the implications, so there's been a debate amongst people who write about the Indian Constitution on something that you address quite centrally. So I was just saying that there's been a debate amongst people who study the Indian Constitution on what is referred to as the centralizing drift, right? And one question is the Constitution by design from the 1950s onwards, from the time of it was made, because as you said, the people who drafted our constitution were already in power. They already wanted to bring about the developmental state. So there's a very centralized focus from the beginning, right? Is that the problem, or is that something that happened along the way? So for me, in chapter 2, you start by saying Indira Gandhi has just won the 1971 election, as you described. That was a huge moment. But almost immediately, she asks for L.K. Jha to be replaced by P.N. Haksar. And then, as you describe, the PMO then becomes extremely powerful very quickly, right? To the detriment of the cabinet secretariat, to others. So this is clearly a very important change, and I think we broadly had a sense of it, but you've given us evidence of exactly how it happens, right? And you focus a lot on Haksar and particularly how he goes about doing this. We know in later years you have the call and the dhars. Mohan Kumaramangalam also becomes part of the inner circle, and the sort of change that is happening, right? So that's clearly something very significant. And I think as I was reading your work, I began to say there may have been a design issue from the beginning, but during the Nehruvian years, Nehru never really took it. He did occasionally, and we know when he imposed president's rule in Kerala and other instances, but by and large, he tried to involve and respect the other two agents. Right? My last question will be about the judiciary, because you commented on that, but maybe just staying on the executive and the significance of that. You've alluded to it, I think it's clear, but you are now making a historical argument about when that centralization really becomes part of our legal system. And so just a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, again, I mean, see, obviously I'm not a scholar of constitutional law, but I follow the literature that you're alluding to. And I think there is a tendency to say that, listen, the centralizing drift is there from the very beginning. The constitution itself has got, in fact, Gautam Bhatia has a book which was out, I think, last year, which actually makes this argument at some length. Now, the only problem with that is that it puts too much onus on structure as opposed to agency of people, right? I mean, so again, I think the contrast with the Nehruvian period is interesting. Because one of the things that Jawaharlal Nehru did was a certain degree of voluntary self-restraint, not just vis-a-vis other institutions, but even vis-a-vis other colleagues within his own party and so on, right? I mean, in fact, even at the time when Nehru was prime minister, I quote, and I think you were alluding to one of those letters, Indira Gandhi writes to him in 1957-58, saying that you're just letting state chief ministers run the show in a way that is totally unacceptable. I mean, why are you doing it? But his sense always was that parliamentary democracy, and I think that is one very important norm, actually operates on a considerable degree of self-restraint on part of all actors. The minute you decide to throw off that self-restraint, and then it is all gloves, if they come off, then the game is going to become something which is much more, nasty in the way that it plays out. So I think Nehru had that kind of a sense, right? I mean, even the way that he dealt with Parliament, for instance, in 1964, I mean, he's trying to get a parliamentary sort of, a constitutional amendment through, and there is not enough quorum in the House. And he says that, no, we'll convene again when there is quorum. And this is that man who's literally on his deathbed, right? I mean, so he had that kind of a sense. Again, we know all the instances where, the president's rule and various kinds of things, First Amendment, all of that stuff. None of that is taken away. But I think he had a general sense that for the workings of a system like this, there is a degree of restraint that all actors need to restrain. Similarly, I would say even with the judiciary, right? I mean, after the early sort of bruises over land reforms and stuff, even the judiciary actually exercises considerable levels of restraint in that period. And, Madhav Khosla has a paper about some of that stuff, which I think is an interesting illustration of the dynamic in that period generally, was that, we need to make a system work, so let's try and hold a little bit back rather than, go all in. So I think that definitely changes. And again, that doesn't change immediately, right? I mean, it only changes when Indira Gandhi feels that the principal threat to her own position is actually from Congress colleagues, right? That is the moment when all bets are off, right? And then you start centralizing, you start slowly aggregating power. But even that aggregation of power is not purely by design, right? I mean, she may have wanted it, but there is no reason she should have had it. She only had it because certain election victories turned out in certain ways, certain kind of wars turned out in certain ways, right? So there was an opportunity to kind of, events also afforded her a lot. And Harold Macmillan says, I mean, events are very important in politics, right? So they have their own dynamic as well. So I think there is definitely a historical shift. And I wouldn't sort of subscribe to this argument that from the very beginning, this is what we were setting ourselves up for.
Thanks. My last question, and this is again my sort of identity as a legal scholar sort of comes in. So you mentioned, three important arguments that you're taking on. I should say, reading it as a law student, there are many important lawyers who come up, right? Even in the cast of characters, Indira Gandhi, really relied on a set of lawyers, and they come to life because you give us helpful backgrounds on these people and tell us about them. In your presentation, also you referred to this. So, all the things that you mentioned. And I know there are law students in the audience. So, bank nationalization, privy purses. Then you get into, the 42nd Amendment and all of that. All of these led to cases. So the last two cases you were talking about President's rule and how the Janata government dismisses all the Congress governments. That leads to State of Rajasthan versus Union of India, and later on as well. Right? So I'm just thinking, going away from the executive to other institutions and how they are behaving. So we know that in the early part, when people like Justice Subbarao were there, the judiciary, as you said, so the judiciary is by and large, okay with the Nehruvian period. They are very deferential. They recognize this is a independence generation, so they tend to back up. But at the start of her tenure, there's a big pushback from the judiciary, and that leads to the Great Battle. And then you say by the late 70s, the judiciary is also sort of holding back, or as I think the phrase you used was rubber stamping, right? So I'm just thinking across how does one think of the long 70s for institutional health generally? And I think of the judiciary, today's papers are reporting Chief Justice Gawai yesterday gave a speech where he again extolled the role that the judiciary has played in upholding the Constitution. Right? It's 75 years of the Constitution as well, and the judiciary obviously believes that it's been one of the pillars of the country in holding that up. So since you've studied really critical judicial decisions and not as a lawyer or a law student, I think you have a unique vantage point to comment on, at least in the long 70s. What's your assessment of the judiciary and what it's done?
Sure. Now, health and safety warning is that what I'm about to say may, harm the sort of law students particularly. So don't take me as a lawyer, right? So I think the problem really starts in my reading with the decision of the Supreme Court in the Golaknath case. Yeah. And as I see it as a historian, that was an entirely political decision. I think the constitutional precedents for giving that kind of a restraint on what could be done, etc., were not available. Justice Subbarao and others are on record as saying that they were worried about the authoritarian tendencies of Indira Gandhi, etc. So they thought that the judiciary has to sort of create some bulwarks, right? But what does Justice Subbarao do soon after? He resigns as Chief Justice of India and runs for the presidency as the opposition's candidate. So what do you expect Indira Gandhi to do? Should she not come to this right conclusion that the judiciary is kind of not operating by established norms, but is actually playing some very different game, which is exactly what they came to. Of course, the conclusions which they drew from it were that, all bets are off. We have to now really get out of the judiciary, which is exactly what they proceeded to. So as I see it, actually 1967 is really the starting point of trouble even with the judiciary, right? And again, I mean, the cases and other things, there's obviously, a lot of toing and froing. It has been studied in great detail. But if you look at, say, what happens by 1973, Keshavananda Bharati and stuff, right? I mean, as a historian, again, I'll say I'm not a student of the constitutional law, but the whole sort of claim that there is a basic structure to the Constitution which is unamendable, to me strikes as an extraordinary departure from everything that was happening in Indian constitutional history up until that point of time. It was an extraordinary claim. I mean, whether we agree, whether we think that claim is true, whether it is good, it is a practically good device for us to have checks and balances, etc. But the idea that there is some aspect of a document which we have collectively self-legislated, which is not open at all. Pratap Mehta recently said that that's like claiming that it's the Sanatan Dharma. Absolutely correct. It is actually as, whatever, extraordinary a claim as that, saying that something is going to be valid forever and that no human agency can change it. So as I see it, from a political perspective, I think the executive really felt that the judiciary was overreaching itself. And then they, of course, went on to. So which only sort of, my argument in this book is that the rules of the game became sort of so frayed precisely because nobody felt that there was anything great to be gained by abiding. And I think that aspect of collective behavior is something that we have to recognize. And we all paid a very heavy price for it, right? Through the emergency. What happens after the emergency, both for Indira Gandhi, the Janata government, all the tragedy and farce that ensues thereafter, is all a result of this stuff. So, which is why I really feel that, when you look at this entire period, I think the historian's verdict is best given in terms of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where the prince says in the last act that all are punished. That's exactly what happens in the 1970s. All are punished. And all deserve to be punished, at least in this historian's judgment, right? So,
Thank you both for the amazing conversation. And I'm Karthik. I'm Arun's colleague at NLS. I'm also very interested in this particular period from a vantage point of a political theorist. So, Srinath, first, congratulations on this amazing book. I'm reading it with great interest, and I have many more questions, which I hope we can talk at leisure. But I wanted to ask, you gave a fantastic explanation on the causes which led to the emergency, both the things which were happening nationally and things which were happening globally. So why was the emergency revoked? So I mean, practically speaking, the opposition was crushed. It was crippled. It was non-existent. Regarding international pressure, I think Indira Gandhi's regime had strong support from the Soviet Union, and the UK and US were also mending fences with the India of the time. And I don't think she would have cared about opinion pieces in the Post or in the BBC. So, what were the possible reasons why she revoked the emergency?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I'll be honest with you, I have not come across any one document where she has sort of put down or someone else has put down on her behalf about what is there. So what I understand is that, from June 1976, a year into the emergency, a series of assessments are being prepared for the Prime Minister by the Intelligence Bureau, by the Prime Minister's Secretariat, which are sent up to her. Now, these are fairly long documents which are available. And especially there is one very longish, some 42, 43 page assessment in October, which she reads in October. I think it's prepared in September. And now that basically, the refrain of that is to say that the first year of the emergency has been good for us because we have managed to keep the opposition down. Economic stability has been attained. Some of the macro sort of indicators that we were worried about, inflation, etc., is under control. The industry seems to be a bit more active because labor unions have been tamed and put under various kinds of constraints. But it also says that, however, you've done other things, some land redistribution for Dalits, other things. But the problem is that certain other things have also been done during this period, which mean that the gains of the emergency are now being eroded, of which they talk about coercive family planning. Interestingly enough, all this is sort of sent up to her, saying that, especially in places like Uttar Pradesh, which is alienating traditional constituencies among Dalits and Muslims, right? And that one of the things, therefore, the opposition is slowly coming together. I mean, they had already started. These people could intercept all the letters which the opposition group leaders were writing, right? So they had the whole correspondence. And their assessment was that while the gains of the emergency are still with us, while the opposition is still in disarray, it may be a good idea for the Prime Minister to think about actually calling for elections and then cash in on this. This is the advice which is given to her. Now, again, interestingly, Indira Gandhi actually does not take that advice immediately. In November 1976, she gets the parliament to extend its own term by a full year. She can do all that because it's emergency, they are controlling all the shots. But then, soon after, in December, there is another assessment which comes from the IB, which actually tells her that, there is more resentment building up against the emergency regime on various counts. There is even a possibility that the Prime Minister's own security might be imperiled, etc. So by early December, the conversations in the PMO start moving more towards saying, if we want to call elections, what should we? So that is the kind of way in which I see it. It is that there is a sense that there are diminishing returns of the emergency regime. The opposition is still weak. So if we go in now, we may do better. I think that is the best judgment that I could make of, but I'm not seeing any one document stating very clearly that why are we calling elections at that point.
Congratulations on the book. I'm also a colleague of Arun's, and I have to ask a simple question. Do universities as an institution are they also worth studying and understanding why, how emergency came about? In particular, I ask in the context of, let's say, academic freedom.
Well, I mean, so universities are a very important part of the story because, from the 1960s onwards, universities are one of the sort of most highly politicized sites in the context of India, right? I mean, as I said, the Naxalbari movement evokes a lot of support from students, particularly. It's limited in geographically, but it's there. The 1974, 73, 74, the entire student movement, which begins in Gujarat as a result, initially as complaints against rising prices, mess bills, etc., then snowballs into various kinds of demands. And what you see there is that it's a standard mixture of student demands about here and now what we are doing, but also about wanting greater control over various aspects of university life, saying that we are never consulted when it comes to making various kinds of decisions. So we need more powers of self-governance. And then when the protests continue, there are clashes with the police, then they take a political sort of a turn, right? I mean, so the students in the universities are actually kind of a very important thing. But again, one of the very interesting things that I found is that, why Jayaprakash Narayan takes over the movement and gives it leadership in Bihar, from Bihar in 1974. But by the end of 1974, JP is actually, not sort of relying so much on students. His power base has become more the other political parties, the Janasangh, the socialists, and others who are willing to send their cadres, right? I mean, including RSS cadres and others are there, right? I mean, so Nanaji Deshmukh, for instance, becomes a very important player as the leader of the Janasangh in the JP coalition. And there's a very interesting letter that I found from a figure who's familiar to all of us called Arun Jaitley, who was then the president of DUSU, the Delhi Union Students' Union. And he actually writes to Jayaprakash Narayan in April 1974 because they're preparing a charter of demands which have to be placed before parliament and stuff. There's going to be this massive demonstration in Delhi. They're planning to get 1 million people into the city. And Arun Jaitley actually writes to Jayaprakash Narayan saying that, this movement began on the back of students. But students have now been highly marginalized. We have not even been called into this drafting committee. So please, do not do this to us. I mean, we are a very important constituent. So you can already see that, the tensions between the students and this thing, right? And again, fast forward, the emergency happens. There's a huge crackdown. Many of you might have been in university campuses at that time, will know what is the atmosphere of repression and terror that was prevalent. But during the emergency, one of the things that happens is that the Youth Congress, which is the sort of youth movement of the Congress Party, youth wing of the Congress Party, swells in hugely in numbers, right? And all of that is attributed to Sanjay Gandhi, Mrs. Gandhi's son. There's this whole thing, 1976 Guwahati Congress. The Youth Congress has their own parallel show, which is lauded as a great thing. And then after the 1977 election is lost, they actually have a discussion in the Congress Working Committee on what happened to the Youth Congress, etc. Why did they not deliver an election victory to us? And another very figure who was then the president of the Youth Congress, Ambika Soni, who later became a prominent Congress Party politician, says something very interesting. She says during the emergency, because all student groups were banned, everyone flocked to the Youth Congress, right? So we had everyone from the RSS to etc. coming. So the way I think about it is that students are an interesting kind of a social and political phenomenon. It's very difficult to pigeonhole them, even for professional politicians and political party structures. Right?
Yeah, hi. Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi once lately famously said that we are living in a time of undeclared emergency. What would you say about the circumstances which are leading to this undeclared emergency and the two leaders who have different kinds of political commitment to the nation?
So, again, with highest regard for Mr. Gopal Gandhi, I would disagree with what he's saying. Because I think the emergency doesn't have to be the only sort of negative pole against which we should measure all the problems that we currently have or will have in the future. See, the emergency was a very different kind of a regime. It was a avowedly authoritarian period. 125,000 people were put into prison without any recourse to law. The entire opposition was jailed. The press was censored. Parliament was muzzled. Courts were muzzled. In fact, the press could not even report on goings on in the parliament and in the courts. When courts gave orders against press censorship, even those were censored. I mean, it was in a real way a very extraordinary period. And I don't think we do ourselves a great sort of analytical service by invoking that to compare with what is happening today. I'm sure Gopal has his own reasons for saying why it's an undeclared emergency. A lot of other people say that, but as a student of this period, it somehow seems to me not a very useful comparison, right? I mean, see, And in general, my orientation as a historian is that I think instead of looking for parallels in history, it is more useful to use history to understand how the present is different from the past, because it is different. This present is a product of the past, right? I mean, so to the extent that the emergency had longer term consequences, we should try and understand it. But it's not very clear to me that it is a useful comparator for whatever is the assessment of the current system and the moment. Because I just feel it's a very different sort of thing. Right? I mean, the BJP, for instance, today is still the most dominant political party in this country. We understand that the executive is very powerful. They have all kinds of agencies. But still, the BJP goes and quotes opposition political leaders from practically all parties. They are trying to woo them, make them get over to their side. They're not putting them in jail. So what is happening today is very different from what happened back then. So it's not very clear to me that these are really comparable situations.
So you said that Indira Gandhi, did she inherit the crisis of hegemony, representation, and sort of governance, or did she amplify it? And when you say that, she broke norms, she broke precedents, I mean, all you can follow is rules. Now, norms are in your mind. So you only gave me that book, In Defense of Politics, where politics is sort of meant to be a contact sport. It's meant to be competitive. It's meant to be brutal. So when you romanticize the period of somebody who got us independence, Jawaharlal Nehru had a stature, he had a monopoly in politics. Once the monopoly breaks down, you have to be a street fighter. So when you say all gloves off, I mean, was that even a choice?
No. So again, let's take the image of a contact sport, right? The fact is that a contact sport can only be a sport if it is still played according to some rules. That is the fundamental thing. Even an activity like war, which is about absolute destruction, still is a rule-bound activity. I feel that is true of all collective human activities, right? I mean, some degree of framing of rules. And when I say norms, I do not mean like some abstract principles to which, but ways in which intersubjectively we agree that what is done and not done, right? I mean, in what circumstance can you dismiss a government? How much time should you give someone to prove their majority on the floor of the house? Do you dissolve a house or not? Those are all things for which there are various kinds of precedents. Even if it's not an Indian parliamentary tradition, there are other traditions, and that's the way. So it is not about saying that, see, if politics were really purely a combat sort of arena, then it would not be politics, right? It would be war. I mean, it would be something else entirely. And even that war, I think, is structured. So first of all, I believe that whichever way you play the game, there are rules of the game, right? And those rules of the game are in some ways not just constraining, but they're also enabling, because they tell you what you can do within that thing. So it's not simply a system of constraints. And thirdly, I think rules also then foster the development of certain kinds of temperaments, right? I mean, that's why we used to say back in the day that, sports make character, right? I mean, it is in that sense that if if the umpire doesn't give you your appeal, you don't glower at him. That is the old cricketing norm, right? That's what you try to inculcate. So I think so that way of thinking is pretty important, and I think we should not disregard that. You're absolutely right, and in fact, it's exactly what I say, that there is no reason to romanticize the Nehruvian period or to believe that everything was working absolutely there. Part of the reason why everything was working was because of the absolute political monopoly which the Congress party had. And you had a leader who was willing, at least within the party structures, to accept certain kinds of restraints and not really sort of right or short over everyone else, right? I mean, so that was what it was there. So naturally, when the sport becomes competitive, then it is easy to disregard rules. But that is precisely when the structuring rules also become quite important. So that's my sense, is that we cannot continually keep disregarding the rules of cricket and thinking that we are still playing cricket beyond a certain point. At some point, that will change into something else, right? I mean, so that to me is the way that I was kind of thinking about it. You're right. I mean, it's not about saying that that there are abstract principles to which we owe allegiance. I don't think so. I think these are more about how we structure interactions. What are the kinds of ways in which we think about it.
Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm a venture capitalist. My question is more around adding to the discussion you just earlier, right? The ease with which the parliamentary democracy system was captured by Indira Gandhi, would that have been a design flaw of the fact that we didn't go with a presidential system, which has a more structured sort of Montesquieuan separation of powers, which is probably what would have been more suitable for the lack of voluntary restraint that would have been sort of attributed to human nature, right? It would have gone down that way. That's one. And second, if you were to situate that within the broader South Asian context, where most of the other countries have had authoritarian sort of move down to authoritarianism fairly quickly and much faster, is a presidential system somewhat more suited, given that politics is a more full contact force and the separation of powers is more discrete and better to improve?
Yeah, so I actually have quite a bit of discussion on precisely this issue because this issue was very live in the 1970s. In fact, when the emergency is imposed, one of the first things that Indira Gandhi's close advisors suggest is that we should very quickly move to a presidential system and that we should actually institutionalize executive directly elected presidency, right? And their model, funnily enough, is the French Fifth Republic inaugurated by Charles de Gaulle. And, there is a lot of discussion around that stuff. And in fact, that continues through to the 80s. I mean, there are, voices within the Congress party and other parts of the political system which actually believe that a presidential model may work better because it will have lesser instability. You don't have this many problems of governments being formed, unformed, etc., right? And Indira Gandhi actually sort of initially allows that discussion to go forward, but then once they leak out drafts of various kinds of schemes and stuff, then she backs off. And then instead what you get is a 42nd Amendment, which is basically a way of entrenching the executive supremacy and their complete control of the judiciary, right? I mean, the 42nd Amendment had extraordinary kind of provisions for controlling the judiciary, which if it had been allowed to continue, would have been, unambiguously authoritarian in the way that we would have operated. And that is exactly what the Janata government undid, right? I mean, that was the major contribution of the Janata government, is that they actually undid some of the worst kind of things which were done in a structural sense to the political system during the emergency.
Hi, I'm Inika. I'm a grade 9 student, and I have to ask, could you please shed some light on the nationalization of the banks of India in 1969, as they played like a pivotal role in Indira Gandhi's reign and the position of India as a whole till today?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I actually have a more or less a full section. In fact, last year I did a talk here at the BIC on precisely that aspect of the book. See, the nationalization of the banking system was a demand which was being made pretty much from the 1950s onwards, right? I mean, if you look at various kinds of All India Congress Committee resolutions, there'll always be some section of Congress people who are saying that, we should just nationalize the banking system, right? I mean, that refrain was there. By the time Indira Gandhi comes to power in 1966, the initial kind of demand is that nationalization, once again, is that argument is raised, but what they get is what they call social control of the banking system. So banks will be given targets saying you have to lend to certain sections of society, lending targets, etc. And then Indira Gandhi in 69, as you correctly said, decides to nationalize the banking system. And the reason she does that is purely a political decision, because she wants to showcase her credentials as a leftist progressive kind of person. And who's taking India towards state control, socialism, etc. And it is that reason that the bank nationalization happens. But, it's a bit like soon after, the day after bank nationalization, the government and Indira Gandhi start asking themselves a question saying, now that we have nationalized the system, what do we do with it, right? So it's a bit like that, the story of the dog which caught the car and then has to decide, having caught the car, what am I supposed to do with it, right? I mean, as long as the chase is there, it's a different thing. And that's when it's fairly extraordinary. And all this stuff we can see in the National Archives. And hopefully some of that will be digitized. Even you can download it and read it for yourself. Fascinating correspondence, because she then starts approaching either she writes directly or there are letters sent by P.N. Haksar, who's a main advisor, to L.K. Jha, others who know things about banking, including chairmen of all kinds of, the nationalized banks, saying, please give us ideas, what can we do, and so on. So one of the people who's very influential is L.K. Jha himself, who's kind of tells her in what ways this system can work to sort of benefit the government, etc. But there are other figures like T.A. Pai, of Syndicate Bank, so who's again another figure whose ideas tend to become quite influential at that point of time, right? So this is again one of those classic cases of if you look at the Reserve Bank of India's official history, right? The official historians of the Reserve Bank of India say, and I entirely concur with them, that nationalization of the banking system was the most important economic policy decision taken in the history of independent India, including liberalization. It's actually a very structural change to the way the state sort of controls the fiscal system, right? It's a very important decision, but it was not taken for economic reasons at all. It was taken for political reasons, and then you started figuring out what you wanted to do. So I just feel it's, again, one of those illustrations of the kind of crooked line logic that I was talking about, right? That things did not move because they thought, okay, we'll take over this system and then we'll do it. They take over the system for some other reason. Then you decide that you have something, then you want to do something else with it, and then we are still living with, as you correctly said, down to this day, the long-term consequences of it, whichever way we assess it, negative or positive, are still there.
Hello, I am Aditya and I'm a third year BSc student. And my question is, what was the impact of the 1973 war in the Middle East on the domestic economic policies of Indira Gandhi?
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, the main consequence of the Arab-Israeli war was that the Arab states, which are also the petroleum exporting countries, and they had an organization called OPEC, which is still there, right? It's a cartel which sets the prices for oil production, producing countries. They decided to increase oil prices in order to put pressure on the United States particularly, because the United States was supporting Israel in that war, right? A bit like what's happening now, right? I mean, so just imagine that if today Saudi Arabia, Iran, I mean, let's assume Iran was not in the war, but all of these countries came together and started hiking up oil prices, right? I mean, it will immediately raise prices for American consumers, right? That, because America was at that point of time still a major consumer of Middle Eastern oil and other things. But the fact is that it is not just the West which is getting affected, right? I mean, there are a range of other countries which are oil importing economies, India being very prominent among them, you know, and which hit us, right? And at that point of time, frankly, you know, petroleum is not just important for fuel in the direct sense in which we think, right? I mean, even other things like fertilizers require petroleum. And fertilizers were central to your story of green revolution, food security, everything that you'd been planning. So this supply side shock, which you got because of a fourfold increase in oil prices, translates into extraordinary inflation in the context of India. That leads to all kinds of industrial conflict. You know, you see a massive sort of increase in industrial strikes because workers demand greater dearness allowance or whatever, you know, inflation adjusted packages. There is a huge kind of spike in labor militancy in this period, eventually culminating in the National Railway strike of 1974. But there is also the whole sort of students, universities, middle class unrest with, you know, galloping inflation, public sector sort of employees and other things. So it has a really extraordinary impact in terms of Indian public because it happens very quickly and is in a very concentrated span. And that then forces Indira Gandhi to start adopting economic policies which you would describe as conservative, in a sense that you go after inflation, you keep wages down, you know, you do various kinds of things. So macroeconomic stabilization policies then become more or less a necessary thing for you to do. She may not have wanted to do it, but the circumstance was such that otherwise the economy would entirely sort of just boil down. And if you read the notes of her, you know, various economic advisors and what they were writing at that time, it's actually quite extraordinary. Everybody recognizes that if we are going to continue down this route, then we are setting ourselves up for a real disaster. So it was a very, very important kind of moment, which was triggered by global economic factors.
Hey, thanks so much, Srinath. Just a quick one. I just wanted to understand a little bit more. You talked about how right up into the 70s, there was this increasing control that, you know, was being exercised in different economic spheres, right? You spoke of the Monopolies and Restricted Trade Practices Act, and there is the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act and changes in the Companies Act also. So I didn't quite understand how you say that that high point of her control regime leads later, 15, 16 years later. In terms of the continuum, I didn't quite follow how it gets to the liberalization that you talk about. Is completely, to my mind, the other way around, isn't it?
No, so what I was trying to say was that effectively 1970s, so see, you have Monopolies, Restricted Trade Practices, Companies Act is amended, Foreign Exchange Act to control foreign direct investment. And then you also have, you know, various kinds of regulatory authorities which are created to kind of, you know, put things under. Now, there is a series of nationalizations which happened. Bank nationalization we spoke about, but coal industries are nationalized, right? But the high point of, and I think the final culminating point of all of this nationalization is a wheat nationalization, which he undertakes in 1974. The entire wholesale trade of wheat is nationalized. So you're eliminating all middlemen. Now, in rural India, at that point of time, most of the middlemen were also the big producers, right? So effectively, you're going against a very big agrarian constituency. And it's a local Congress governments which start pushing back, saying that, you know, we are really going to lose support on the ground if we are going to do this. Because Congress party is very much in hawk to various kinds of landed interests from the very beginning of, you know, land reforms and stuff. So, you know, it's not something, they are very happy to work with all of those interests. So now the wheat nationalization, then Indira Gandhi, who's such a powerful prime minister, actually rolls back after almost 8 months. And she does all of this because of this supply side shock, which has come from the global sort of oil shock, inflation. And then, so that I see as pretty much the high watermark of the leftist, socialist kind of phase of Indira Gandhi. So I see that actually as a delimited phase. After that, what you see are a set of policies which are, funnily enough, about undoing the same sets of things that they have done, right? The same set of people in some cases who advocated certain policies are now forced to say that how can we relax something? How can we give more permissions to someone to produce within certain licenses? How do we allow new incumbents to come in, right? And Manish and I were talking about, like, say, for instance, there's a whole pharmaceutical kind of, regime, patents and other things are kind of relaxed at the time, which allows for Indian companies to start coming in a big way. So there are all kinds of contradictory or contrary to what is the kind of regime that they wanted to install, they start moving towards, and that is a very important kind of measures which start unrolling. And as I say, that is what slowly but steadily builds up a group of people and a thinking within the political economic system, policy system, that we actually need more full-throated liberalization, right? So the ideas which then lead towards that particular moment, the momentum is starting to build from about 10 years earlier, let's say. Yes.
Hi. For world leaders, there is a new status called Vishwa Guru status. How well she suited for that status and how well she was respected by the world leaders?
Well, I mean, again, I must say that there isn't that much on foreign policy in this book, even though my original interest in academics was very much in terms of, history of foreign policy, etc. See, in a sense, with the Indira Gandhi sort of period in Indian sort of foreign policy, etc., what you see is that there is a much greater concern about security, about dominance of your immediate neighborhood, rather than worrying about various kinds of things, how you are seen in this forum or that forum. In the Nehruvian period, there was a lot more of India sort of standing up for this thing, apartheid in South Africa, etc. I mean, she was also there, did all the NAM, Third World Summits and various kinds of things. But I don't think in the core of her foreign policy, those things counted for very much. She was much more hard-nosed about saying that, listen, this is a very volatile sort of system for, time for India, for the global economy. So we need to make sure that various kinds of things, right? So Pakistan is sorted out. You have Bangladesh, which is created. Sikkim, which was at that point of time a quasi-independent state, is absorbed into the Indian Union. So you basically ring fence yourself from various kinds of things. And she was that way pretty hard-nosed about various kinds of things. And frankly, if I look back at that time, you can also see the beginnings of a certain kind of disenchantment with policies of third world solidarity. In fact, there's a very interesting note that I found, which was prepared for her in 1975 by the perspective planning division of the Ministry of External Affairs, right? So they do this kind of long-term policy notes and all. So one of those notes actually says that, look at the impact of the oil shocks on India, right? Now we have had to absorb all of this. We have taken real hit in terms of various kinds of problems. And the countries which are responsible for this increase in price are countries to whom we extend unconditional solidarity in the name of third world unity, right? Is this really in India's interest to do this? So you already see those kinds of questions starting to come up to say that given India's particular economic position, where we are an oil importing economy which is dependent on external supplies, should we actually be sort of in unconditional support of various kinds of measures to, in order simply to express political or third world sympathy and stuff? So I think, frankly, with her, those things counted for much lesser than a very, hard-nosed and tough kind of assessment of what India's real kind of security interests were and so on.
So you have a particular interest in sports, particularly cricket. I want to ask you a question. How much Indira Gandhi interfered in matters of cricket, sports, and Bollywood, for that matter of fact?
There is again, I cannot speak to what happened earlier, but when the Asiad Games were happening in 1982, right? I mean, she obviously took a lot of interest in that because that was seen as showcasing India's kind of arrival at a certain kind of platform with this, all of this stuff. And the whole event was staged, whatever, the management of the entire kind of Asiad Games, especially the inaugural ceremony, was done by Rajiv Gandhi, who at that point of time was a political novice, and he was brought in because Sanjay Gandhi died, and she kind of put him there. But there's a very interesting letter that she writes to a friend of hers called Dorothy Norman soon after the Asiad Games happened, saying that the games were so fantastic because I think these games have done more than anything else to bring this highly fissiparous country together. Right? She just thinks that opposition leaders are out to get her. There are all these movements kicking off in Assam, Punjab, Kashmir. And she actually says that, I've realized through this Asiad Games that sports is perhaps one thing which actually holds this country very effectively together and creates a kind of national sentiment which we otherwise seem to lack. So that's the only sort of reference that I have seen to. Yeah.
Okay. And on that note, on behalf of the BIC, I'd like to thank Srinath not only for his talk, but also for engaging with the varied nature of questions that we had today. Thanks, Arun, for very quickly accepting our invitations. Thank you all for being here. The books are available for sale outside, and Srinath will be signing copies. So thank you, and have a wonderful weekend ahead.